Israel had to be a colonial enterprise. You couldn't possibly establish a Jewish state in Palestine
Yeah.
without coming in with force of empire. In order to maintain your power, you have to dehumanize the other. As you dehumanize the other, you dehumanize yourself. You lose your own humanity. You don't get to be New York Times bureau chief without being blind. The New York Times had an article about a caviar farm in Israel
I know.
where the workers went to work despite the war to ship caviar to Europe. The New York Times had a feature, a whole page about this freaking caviar farm.
And the ICC no longer has the power.
When you say ICC no longer, it never did have the power. There's an international legal definition of what constitutes genocide. Whatever I think of it, there's an international legally accepted definition, which, according to leading Jewish Israeli scholars of genocide, Israel's present actions meet that definition.
Yeah.
Sanders' point of view is a cop-out. He makes it all about Netanyahu.
And do they think there can be peace without Israel somehow being held accountable?
Everything the Americans said about the Soviets is also true. What they each said about themselves was total lies. So this rule-based order has always been a lie.
What are the psychological impacts of for all of us living in a system where value is strictly measured in profit?
What people should realize is I struggle with the same stuff like everybody else. In terms of anxiety or depression or despair or hopelessness, I can go through all those states.
Today on Out Loud, I'm joined by someone whose work has profoundly shaped how I understand pain, politics, and the stories we carry in our bodies. Dr. Gabor Maté is a physician, Holocaust survivor, and one of the most courageous voices speaking out in this moment of moral collapse. His work on trauma, addiction, and child development has influenced millions, myself included. But quite frankly, it's his refusal to stay silent that makes him essential right now. Once a Zionist youth leader, Dr. Maté now calls himself a former Zionist, and he has in recent weeks called Gaza a concentration camp, described Israel as an apartheid state, engaging in ethnic cleansing, and has consistently challenged the ideological, psychological, and political machinery behind this genocide. In this conversation, we dive deep into the wounds we inherit, the lies we tell ourselves, and the choices we must make to remain human in dystopian times like these. Dr. Gabor Maté, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me.
Thank you, Ahmed. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me just clarify that the phrase concentration camp doesn't originate with me. It was an Israeli social scientist called Baruch Kimmerling, who first called Gaza the world's largest concentration camp, and that was decades ago.
Appreciate that.
As far as apartheid,
Yeah.
several months before October the 7th, hundreds of Israeli scholars put out a paper calling Israel an apartheid state. So I'm simply repeating, well, the obvious, but what I'm saying is that these phrases originate not with enemies of Israel, but with Israelis themselves who've acknowledged the nature of their relationship to Palestinians. So I'm just part of a much larger group. It's not my own phrasing that you're quoting here.
I appreciate that. And that's useful, I think, for our listeners and the framing, because to me, that makes those statements all the more palpable when they come from people in the know. I kind of want to start with the obvious, if you will. You've described yourself, as I mentioned, as a former Zionist. So I'm curious what you once believed and sort of what catalyzed such a profound shift, if I may describe it as such, in terms of your views. I mean, was it a gradual reckoning, Gabor, or was there a moment when your belief in Zionism really began to fracture?
Zionism, like any ism, is an ideology, which comes with a set of assumptions, a certain understanding of the world, of one's position in the world, and so on. And there was a time in my life when that ideological framework made sense. And that had to do with, look, we're recording this in mid-July 2025. 4 weeks ago today, I was in Auschwitz. And I stood at the very place where my grandparents would have got off the transport train to be sent to the gas chambers. And where, as an infant, I almost ended up with my mother in 1944, in June 1944. Given that background of horrific suffering and persecution, at a certain point in my life, it made sense to me that there should be a Jewish state where we can protect ourselves, have our own boundaries and our own army, our own culture. We'd be free to be ourselves
Yeah.
and not face persecution and be helpless in the presence of enemies. And that's what Zionism offered. It also offered a kind of triumphalist view of Jewish history after 2,000 years of exile. So the story goes, we find our way home again.
Mm-hmm.
Who doesn't want to be at home? Yeah. So it made all kinds of sense. And it made emotional sense also as a balm to the woundedness of being hated, experienced as a child, even, never mind my infancy under the Nazis, but growing up in Eastern Europe, there was a lot of anti Semitism. But like any ideology, Zionism excludes certain facts that don't fit in with its message. And the fact that it excluded, apart from certain assumptions about Jewish history that are highly questionable, for example, the exile 2,000 years ago, it's a story. And it's a story that can be questioned very seriously. But the biggest thing was that Zionism excludes the awareness or the acknowledgement that was actually a people living there, Palestine, and those people, some of them originates in ancient Palestine. Some of them were people that have come since and intermingled and intermarried and so on. But there was a genuine, definite people living there.
Like my parents.
And who knows how their ancestors, And those people, in order to realize the Zionist dream, had to be discounted as worthwhile human beings who have the right to their homes, who have the right to their land, who have the right to their own heritage, the right to their own history, and who have the right for self-determination. So all that had to be denied. And it's when I began to find out that there was that other experience that Zionism necessarily had to exclude, deny, and tell lies about, that I began to let go of it. So it was a gradual process, but it was, how can I say, invigorated or triggered by the 67 war. Because in 67, the research on that war, it turned out that instead of this narrative of poor little Israel being set upon by all these Arab armies who were determined to destroy it, Israel had actually started the war and fomented the war. I wrote an article in 67 after I did the research in which I said that Israel fought this war to capture territory that they'll never give back. I said that in 1967.
And that was prophetic.
And my father kicked me out of the house. Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you say that. And it's really resonates with me when you talk about Zionism at an early age for you making emotional sense, that distinction.
Yeah.
And also
Yeah.
you talked about the message of Zionism. As you know, there was a cost with your father for speaking truth to power. And in many ways, I can relate to that with my father, although our relationship has evolved. Because you talk about the message of Zionism, I'm curious, Gabor, what myths or messages or narratives for you were the hardest to let go of? Or how did your own Jewish identity factor into that shift, that letting go?
I don't mind getting disillusioned. That wasn't my first disillusionment. I grew up you're in Serbia right now, you tell me. I grew up next door in Hungary
I know.
under communism. And as an infant, the Soviet army saved my life. And I grew up in a communist system. And I fully believed in its ideals, of a just world, of equality, of non-exploitation and so on, which of course was a lie because the communist system in Eastern Europe and Hungary was a brutal dictatorship. And growing up, of course, my parents couldn't tell me that because, a child speaking the truth would get the parents into trouble.
Yeah.
And our teachers couldn't tell me that. So in 56, there was a revolution in Hungary against communist rule and against Soviet rule that was brutally defeated by the Soviet army. So that same army that had saved my life and that I idealized and that same system that I had believed in turned out to be the opposite of what it pretended to be. I got disillusioned. Okay. Then we came to the West, and I believed in the Western ideas of democracy in America as the shining city on the hill, and America as the defender of freedom,
Yeah.
until the Vietnam War, where I saw this freedom-loving, democracy embracing America massacre millions of Asians.
Mm-hmm.
The press lied about it
Mm-hmm.
and didn't tell the truth about it until later on. It turns out everything they had said was a lie. And we could see that at the time. I got disillusioned again. So by the time I come to Zionism, I was used to letting go of ideologies. I was used to letting go of cherished beliefs that turned
Mm-hmm.
out to be either faulty, flawed, or literally frauds. And it's not a bad thing. People always think disillusionment. Oh, no, I got disillusioned. I say to people, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned?
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you rather believe in some fantasies and some views of reality that are far from the truth, or would you rather know the truth? So disillusionment is a good thing. So by the time it came to Zionism, I said, okay, here's another set of ideas I need to let go of. Every time you get disillusioned, it's a liberation.
Yeah. I love that.
For some kind of limitation.
Of course.
So I didn't experience it as that difficult. And I think what was difficult about it is that every time you get disillusioned and you let go of an ideology, then the people that continue to believe in that ideology, they don't like you anymore.
Of course.
Because they want to hold on to that particular...
Or they're afraid of you. Just
and fear is major because that fear shows up in the refusal to look at the facts. Now, my father, bless his soul, came around and we reconciled long before we agreed with each other because, he loved me. And later decades, he actually saw what I was talking about. The most difficult part was I had a lot of emotion tied up with being I loved the Israeli music and the dancing and the community, I had to let go of all that. I missed it, but you know what? Something in me always wants the truth more than it wants to belong, more than it wants acceptance.
how you are. Yeah. I don't mean to interrupt, but I can definitely relate to that for better or worse. And because you brought up your father, my father also studied in Berkeley in the 60s. A Palestinian who was forced to flee Jaffa in 1948, for better or worse, with his family. And I bring him up because we've often spoken about the student encampments we saw popping up when I finally, after a decade and a half working in US media and being disillusioned time and time again and being dehumanized on a personal level, but also, I saw during Vietnam and I learned through my father's stories how, as you said, the student encampments, or let's say the student movement, eventually pushed the mainstream media to kind of, as you said, admit that there had been lies and kind of take the sides of justice, if you will, or at least accountability, right? And that's why the crushing of the student movement globally, but particularly in the US, and the well-coordinated, well-funded attempt to prevent these students from sort of moving the needle, even if it has somewhat succeeded, to me, and I think so many of our listeners, people can relate to what you're saying, which is that they had I think a lot of people right now, Gabor, are feeling that the illusions that they weren't aware of that were illusions are suddenly impossible to unsee as it pertains to the US.
Yeah.
And I wonder, my father's trauma and your grandparents, your father's trauma, trauma's inherited. And one thing I respect so much about your work is you argue that trauma, particularly in the context of Israel and Palestine, both Jewish trauma and Palestinian trauma, which runs in our DNA, if you will, you and I, what do you mean by this idea that trauma is what fuels the violence? How does unresolved trauma actually mutate into what I would describe as collective cruelty? That's what's happening to the Palestinians now.
First, it just breaks my heart that this trauma that was endured here is not used to justify the traumatization of the Palestinians. Number one. Number two, I also got that for my fellow Jews who, in a sense, carry Auschwitz in their DNA, that horror, that unspeakable horror, that mechanized murder of millions, if that's what you identify with, and if that's what your self-image is based on, you're never going to see the Palestinians because you're going to be far too afraid to go of that identification and then the supposed defense that Israel provides against that victimization. So certainly that Jewish trauma psychologically helps to explain much of the response to Palestine on the part of many Jews. That's true. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at any colonial system, whether it's the British in India or the British in China or the British in Africa or the Belgians in the Congo or the Spanish and the Portuguese in South America or the British in North America or the United States vis-a-vis the indigenous population in the 19th century or the United States and its foundation in slavery. Colonial systems behave in certain ways that are rather stereotypical. And Israel had to be a colonial enterprise. You couldn't possibly establish a Jewish state in Palestine without coming in with force of empire, in this case, the British Empire, and not the American Empire. So in that sense, the trauma provides a theme and a sort of an emotional coloring to what's going on. But at the same time, it's also a classical colonial situation where the indigenous population is just a nuisance that has to be got rid of.
And Gabor, if I may, they declared this, the early Zionists. It's not as though this was hidden. I mean, they declared it, they documented it, and they admitted it.
I know. That's what I found out when I did my research. This is the kind of stuff they never tell you about. Ben Gurion and Jabotinsky very openly said, Ben Gurion being the first prime minister of Israel, Jabotinsky, the founder of the strain of Zionism that the Likud party number. And they both said that we can call the Palestinians, the Arabs, terrorists, but actually they're just people trying to defend their homeland. And we're the aggressors. And we will do the same thing in their place. They said this openly. They're not like Netanyahu who says, oh yeah, we're defending freedom and we're the victims. And no, they're very open about it. So what I'm saying is just reducing it to trauma is a kind of a psychological bypass. Yes, trauma goes into fueling the emotional flavor of it and the justification for it. But the fundamental colonial impulse, which is we have to take over whatever land we're contesting from the local population at whatever the cost to them, that's universal.
I hear you. And you know what I'm thinking of as you're speaking, if I may? You know, I've been to Auschwitz myself. I was 19. I went to visit my friend Martin in Poland, and we went together. And long story short, I think it's impossible to visit that physical space, forget all the things that are on display reminding us of why this should never again. And I had, you know, I'm a very sort of sensitive child in the sense that often when I experience powerful emotions, I feel them in my body, they manifest, you know. And I say that because I was so nauseous. As a Palestinian, as a human, as someone who really does believe in these, at the time I was maybe naively really believing in these ideals, these illusions of dignity and liberty and fraternity, whether in France or in the US, you know, the Western ideals that are liberal ideals. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is today, Gabor, a new poll of Israeli Jews, as you know, from Penn State, says that overwhelmingly, I think 82% support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza.
And almost 50% or more support the expulsion of all Palestinians from all of what they call Israel.
Exactly. And if I'm not mistaken, I wrote this down, 47% support killing all Palestinians in the cities in Gaza that the Israeli forces are capturing. So the reason I say this is not necessarily to try to depict Israelis as, you know, bloodthirsty or what have you, But I want to talk about the weaponization of trauma, of injustice, of not just the Holocaust, but you wrote, "Never again" is not a tribal slogan. And the
Yeah.
murder of your grandparents in Auschwitz does not justify, as you just said, the ongoing dispossession and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. If we can take a step back and talk a little bit about the soul, what does it do to the soul of a society? You know, I've been to Israel, I've been to the West Bank, I've never been to Gaza like yourself, but I'm curious to hear you speak about the soul of Israeli society when genocide is being repurposed as a justification for occupation and violence.
First of all, let's just acknowledge again that this word genocide, which I was very hesitant to apply to Gaza, because when I think of genocide, I think of the deliberate extermination. However, it's not a subjective phrase. There's
Mhm,
an international legal definition of what constitutes
mhm,
genocide. Whatever I think of it, there's an international legally accepted definition,
mhm.
which, according to leading Jewish Israeli scholars of genocide, Israel's present actions meet that definition.
I was just going to say that, but I'm glad you did. Over 55 Jewish scholars on the Holocaust and genocide
Yeah.
are saying that.
Yeah. So again, we're not talking whether you like the phrase,
Mhm,
and I don't,
mhm,
or whether you don't like it. There's a legal definition,
mhm.
which again, Israeli Jewish scholars and never and others recognize is what's happening right now. So that's the first point. In terms of, is your question about weaponization?
Yeah, and victimhood. I mean, you've written that victimhood doesn't lead to peace, right? And that when trauma
Yeah.
becomes a national identity, it can justify violence and harm. And in Israel, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that to a certain extent, the trauma of the Holocaust is so deeply embedded, as you said, in the identity, not wrongfully,
Not wrongfully.
maybe. It's not a stretch for my brain as someone who always seeks to empathize, even with someone causing me and my people a lot of pain, an
Yeah.
immeasurable amount of pain. I mean, what happens when that pain becomes a shield of sorts against accountability? It feels like there's a psychological toll of sort of moral exceptionalism. Like, I sometimes wonder, how is it that so much of Israel, you know, Bernie Sanders talks about Netanyahu as a war criminal and Netanyahu is the problem. And then you see these sobering statistics about what Israeli people,
Sa-
society,
Sanders
yeah.
Sanders' point of view is a cop out. He makes it all about Netanyahu. He always keeps it about Netanyahu. It's not
Mhm,
about Netanyahu. Netanyahu is just the latest and the most egregious manifestation of an ideology that has been veering in the same direction for decades, many decades.
mhm.
And the settlements were not started by Netanyahu, they were started by labor. And it was this sainted Yitzhak Rabin who said, let's break the bones of Palestinian kids. You know, they deliberately set out to break the bones of children. And so Netanyahu was only the latest manifestation. And what the Sanders and, who bless his soul, he's Jewish and he's one of the first prominent American Jews to actually even vaguely criticize Israel.
Mhm.
And it's not about the personality of Netanyahu, it's about the whole system.
And if I may, I mean, let me ask it plainly, because I'm using sometimes a lot of big words, and maybe that's not helpful for the audience. Why do you think Israeli leaders and so much of its society remain so committed to this scale of violence, bombing tents, starving millions of civilians, shooting children, shooting people trying to access food, completely detonating and eradicating any sign of life in terms of schools, hospitals? I mean, Israel claims, as does the US and many others, the right to defend itself. And I've heard Francesca Albanese, who I have a lot of respect for, as well as yourself and others, try to contextualize this. But in your view, Gabor, how has that right to defend themselves, the claim, been weaponized, or has it, to normalize mass murder? I mean, is self defense a euphemism for impunity?
So, first of all, Hitler did not set out to murder all the Jews. He wanted to get rid of them.
Hmm.
His original plan was to send them to Madagascar. or somewhere in the third world. So what happens in that society, however, is once you embark in a certain trajectory, your heart gets harder and harder and harder. And you end up gassing children to death in gas chambers. And you can see the same thing happens in all colonial societies, is that in order to maintain your power, you have to dehumanize the other. As you dehumanize the other, you dehumanize yourself. You lose your own humanity. Zionism doesn't set out to dehumanize the Palestinians. It sets out to dominate them, to expel them. But in order to expel them and dominate them, they have to make them less than human. And as soon as you do that, your own heart gets harder. And then the more it goes on, the harder and harder you become. So what's happening now is the inevitable process or the inevitable result of dehumanization, which gets worse and worse and worse. Now, recently there's been these horrific scenes of Palestinians desperately lining up for food and being killed, being shot at, being wounded in large numbers. When I was in Auschwitz, I was given a set of 10 books, a box set all about Auschwitz. I'm reading them. Here's one of them. In the Warsaw Ghetto, when the Germans wanted to collect people at this place called the Schachplatz, which is the collection point from which they shipped people to Treblinka and Majdanek, these death camps, they offered them bread and jam. And those people they were offered bread and jam to get on these trains. These people were starving, and then they were taken to their deaths. Energetically, what's happening is it's almost identical. These people are offered food, and then they're killed. And so what I'm saying is that once you start on a certain trajectory, you end up becoming harder and harder and harder and more cruel and more cruel and more cruel. And that's what's happened to Israeli society.
Go on.
The book I showed you is by Primo Levi, who's a beautiful, it's one of the most beautiful books of the 20th century. And the original title is If This Is a Man, also published as Survival in Auschwitz. And Primo Levi says this in the very beginning of his book. He was a Jewish engineer from Italy who was taken to Auschwitz in December 1943 and spent over a year there. He was finally liberated by the Russians in January of 45. He says, many people, many nations can find themselves believing more or less consciously that every stranger is an enemy. For the most part, this conviction lies buried in the mind like some latent infection. It betrays itself only in random, disconnected acts and is not the basis of a system of thought. But when this happens, when this unspoken dogma becomes a major premise in your mind, then at the end of the chain lies the concentration camp. And so what he's saying is, as soon as you make some other people your enemy and you yourself the victim, then the end result is the concentration camp.
Gabor, I appreciate you sharing that passage because for me, if I can speak frankly, when you speak about societies that lose their moral compass or that hardening you were referring to under the weight of trauma and ideology, given the normalization of mass killing and the level of dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli discourse, I hate to put it in such a term, but I want to share this with you because it's some of my deep inner thoughts when I'm struggling to keep my own humanity intact, to navigate this world as a Palestinian who may not have grown up there. But, in the diaspora as a Jew, it's the same thing, right? In the sense that I guess my question is Israeli society suffering from a kind of social illness? Or is there a sickness? This hardening, can it be described as either a psychological disorder? I mean, must they disassociate when they call or justify the mass murder of children? As you know, it's been 2 years almost of genocide. And Gabor, I follow this unfortunately very closely because I'm trying to get the word out there. I mean, every day, hundreds of people are, if not 100, 150, 200, are just being killed, slaughtered. And there's no movement. I mean, you've spoken about trauma clouding perception. Anybody who's critical of Israeli policy, you, me, or UN experts like Francesca Albanese, today, the US is going to sanction Francesca Albanese. And
Are they really?
yeah, they just announced it, the Trump administration 3 hours ago.
Isn't
Beyond
that
that, Google,
fraud?
when you search for Francesca, and the reason I say this is because so many Palestinians, so many people around the world, Jewish people, look to her, look to people who are bold enough to sort of speak truth to power like yourself. So I'm wondering, like, all these attempts to label and me, you, or you a self-hating Jew, perhaps, I'm not saying that,
Yeah, no,
labeling her an anti-Semite because her most recent report points to the companies like Palantir and Microsoft and Google and the corporations that are profiting off this genocide. And she says that's the reason no one is moving. I mean, one of my questions to you, I hope we have time to get to that. Why is the world not moving, right? That's a question. I mean, is this all a trauma-based response? Is it a calculated political strategy?
but again, I'm cautioning against trying to give a psychological explanation.
What is the explanation, in your humble
It's
opinion?
colonialism. It's the imperial world. It's not just Israel. Israel by itself is nothing but a little flea that that could maybe cause an itch in an elephant's ear, but that's about it.
But isn't this the
Those,
weaponization of
what?
anti-Semitism as well? Is it not that? Is that
That,
what's happening when the US sanctions Francesca Albanese?
they're using that, but that's not their motive. They don't give a damn about anti-Semitism. What they care about is their own domination in the world.
And so she and voices who expose or hold up a mirror are a threat to that
Their
domination?
their threat to the imperial domination of the world. That's what they're a threat to. And Israel is nothing on its own. It's nothing. Israel is a puffed up little frog, but puffed up by the military and the political and economic might of the Western world. And all the colonial countries, like Belgium, that murdered 12 million Congolese, and the Dutch. Did you know that the Dutch killed nearly 300,000 Indonesians after the Second World War in order to maintain their empire?
Mhm.
Nobody even teaches you that.
Of course.
You know, Britain and the millions of human beings whose blood, is not yet dry on British hands.
Mhm.
I'm speaking historically.
Mhm.
These are all so it's not just about Israeli society.
Mhm.
It's about the Western imperial world. So then anti-Semitism and Jewish trauma is used to justify all that, but it's not the motive force. The motive force is the desperation of the empire to maintain itself.
Mhm.
And that's why Francesca, who's one of the great human beings in the world right now, is being sanctioned. And because she's a threat to that. Jewishness, anti-Semitism, those are side issues that are used, weaponized, as you say, but they're not the motive.
When I graduated from Columbia with a graduate degree in journalism, my first
Yeah,
or second job was at the New York Times. It was during the Iraq War. I was young. I was technically savvy. I was good enough to get hired after 7 rounds of interviews, and then 6 months later, I quit.
yeah,
And the reason I share that with you is because there was something inside of me, and, I've worked for many different US media organizations. I've had a front row seat, if you will, to how that dehumanization of Palestinians has permeated the media, how the media has manufactured consent to
yeah,
uphold that structure, the domination of imperialism. And I
yeah.
know you've said yourself, about the media, you've encouraged people, if I may, you've said people need to look beyond the mainstream propaganda. When you do look at Israeli media as compared with the US or even the EU, You see headlines in Haaretz and the Times of Israel recently, in a couple last days, using terms like concentration and camp to accurately describe what Israel's stated policy is this week. They're going to move all the Palestinians, essentially, as you said, into these concentration camps. I recently sat on a panel in Athens, Gabor, which was hosted by the New York Times, titled, "How Can There Be a Lasting Peace in the Middle East?" And I was struck by the absurdity of talking about peace, right, and lasting peace. And what a lot of the participants started speaking about is Israel as a democracy and how it's distinct in the region and how they have a right to self-defense and how can we get to peace. I guess what I want to know from you is, are you as perplexed as me when people try to talk about a lasting peace with no effort or time or attention given towards accountability, towards reckoning with the founding violence of Zionism? Isn't peace without accountability just a continuation of domination and colonialism and war, but maybe by other means?
What are you perplexed about?
I'm perplexed that we're still 2 years into a genocide having these sorts of conversations amongst what I would hope are critical thinkers, people who are, or maybe are they willfully, like this New York Times bureau chief, these people who have studied and traveled and have degrees from top universities, are they willfully blind? Do they think there can be peace without Israel somehow?
Well, you don't get to be New York Times bureau chief without being blind.
Fair enough.
Look at Chris Hedges. He was New York Times bureau chief for the Middle East.
True.
But he started reporting the truth. They couldn't handle that. He had to quit. A Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter.
True.
These people are not unintelligent, but they don't get to be in their positions without either consciously or unconsciously shutting their eyes. And they have their families to support. They have their jobs and their careers to maintain. And if you look at the New York Times, how many times Israeli hostages or Israeli victims of war have been humanized, their names given, their stories, their family backgrounds? You don't get that with Palestinians, hardly ever. At the height of the start, when there were pictures of skeletal Palestinian children in Gaza, the New York Times had an article about a caviar farm in Israel.
I know.
Where the workers went to work despite the war to ship caviar to Europe. The New York Times had a whole page about this freaking caviar farm. I couldn't believe my eyes.
Well,
meanwhile, so it takes an incredible disconnect. Now, here's the deal. Albert Speer, who was Hitler's economics minister and architect, and a Nazi war criminal, who barely escaped with his life and spent 20 years in Spandau jail. In his autobiography, in his memoirs, he said, people keep asking what I knew at the time. He said, that's not the right question. The right question is what I could have known if I'd wanted to. And then he gives examples of where he could have found out more about what was happening, but he deliberately didn't. So this is in Nazi Germany, where there was no social media. There was no alternative media where you could find out the truth. There was not a Haaretz, which not consistently, but often enough tells the truth about the occupation and Gaza. And so, but today, people have every opportunity to find out what's going on. So if these intelligent people, that doesn't perplex me. It tells me that they've made a commitment to something other than the truth. So why would that perplex me?
And I guess it comes back to who writes history. I mean, the New York Times, I don't want to bash the New York Times, but I do appreciate you speaking candidly because
the New York Times is very, very clear. It says all the news that's fit to print.
That's why I had to quit after 6 months, if I'm honest. Look, what I want to say is for the last few weeks, Israel's been killing, and I think this says it all, about 100 Palestinians a day, right? Children every day in the most gruesome ways. And yet, not one headline in the New York Times in the last 7 days about this. Yet yesterday...
They did report the bombing of that cafe.
Exactly. But then, when 5 soldiers were killed, I think the day before yesterday,
That's in the paper.
it's the headline. It's the top
I
of the
know.
paper. The New York Times, if we're gonna look at this unemotionally, they're clearly valuing, from a news judgment perspective, and prioritizing the deaths of soldiers in an army that's presumably committing genocide
Yeah.
over the victims of this genocide that Jewish genocidal scholars are calling a genocide, whether we are comfortable with that term or not, as you said. So I guess
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying, why am I surprised? And maybe you're right to say that. But, how do we recover from this? Gabor, I'm sure, and I followed your work enough to know that you often talk to audience members when they ask you this question. What does it mean? And I ask Francesca sometimes, when international law, when the ICC no longer has the power to restrain the powerful. I mean, you see European countries allowing Netanyahu to fly over their airspace, even though,
I'm sorry to interrupt,
please.
but you're still being naive. When you say ICC no longer, it never did have the power.
Fair enough.
The ICC went after these petty war criminals from Africa.
I know what you mean.
But compared to Tony Blair,
Oh, yeah.
there were nobody.
Yeah.
George Bush and Tony Blair, speaking of the Iraq War, based on a total lie that a 5-year-old child could see through at the time,
True.
killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. The ICC never went after them. So that, again, it's a question of who sets up these institutions and for what purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like the ICC lost its power. It never did have the power.
Fair enough. And I appreciate that. But I guess the question remains for me, and let me just distill it to the point. In this seemingly lawless jungle, Western leaders and Western media establishment talk about the rules-based order, right? When it's convenient. But when those rules are violated with impunity by the Israeli government, for example, and its backers, the US government, when genocide is live streamed and protected, what remains of this myth? When the hypocrisy is, as the emperor has no clothes, as bare as it is in this moment for you, me, and even potentially 5-year-olds or 5th graders, my friends' kids, can see that even in their limited view, what's happening is just wrong.
Yeah.
I wonder, how do we begin? Let's try to be a bit constructive, if you believe there is something constructive to say. Where do we go from here in terms of trying to preserve our own humanity, preserve whatever rules-based order did ever exist, if it did, and sort of preserve a future with AI and the proliferation of these technologies from Palantir and Microsoft and Google that are so structural in the architecture of the occupation, the genocide? I mean, when genocide becomes such a business model and so exposed, how do we break this cycle? Is there hope in your mind when it comes to Israel and Palestine, but also for everyone else in the world who's watching this in horror? As we know, there's a shift amongst people around the world in terms of awareness of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. But given sort of the machinations of geopolitics and how the powerful are consolidating their power seemingly, how Palantir, this technology, this company that's being used to spy potentially on all Americans, we've seen these cycles, right, of technology being used for bad, and technology isn't inherently good or bad. But I wonder, do you have hope that there's a way to still preserve that which we were always sold on by these Western institutions?
Well, look, first of all, there's nothing new. The British East India Company,
Fair enough.
the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
the Dutch East India Company, Royal Dutch Shell, any of these huge corporations, when were they ever not based on the ruthless exploitation of indigenous resources and the killing of indigenous or the suppression of indigenous people? That's not new. It's been going on. And a really powerful case can be made that the whole Western capitalist system emerged into its glory at the expense of 100 Holocausts. In fact, there's a book called 100 Holocausts, just studying that. So that's not new. It's only, and there was never a rule-based order. There was never a rule-based. Look, I came out of the Soviet Eastern Europe and believing in the West.
Yeah.
And what I actually realized after a while that everything the Soviets had said about the Americans was true, and about being imperialists and world, cruel. Everything the Americans said about the Soviets was also true. What they each said about themselves was total lies. So this rule-based order has always been a lie.
Fair enough.
It's never been the Vietnam War.
Oh, go ahead.
So if you ask me where there's hope, it's not in the systems. It's in human beings.
Yeah.
It's in human beings. And the question of cruelty and domination and exploitation, that's as old as the question of civilization itself. And so what's astonishing is you read a book like this by Primo Levi or other books about Auschwitz, people still held on to their humanity.
True.
And Primo Levi, who came out of Auschwitz, ended up supporting Palestinian rights. And he wasn't the only one. And so what I'm saying is, let me read you something that he wrote. He writes a poem at the very beginning of this book. And
Please.
where is it?
Take your time.
Yeah, he says, I'm going to read you this whole poem if I may.
Please.
He says, you who live safe in your heated houses, you who come home at night to find hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who toils in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for half a loaf, who dies by a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman with no hair and no name, with no more strength to remember, with empty eyes and a room as cold as a frog in winter. Ponder that this happened. I consign these words to you. Carve them into your hearts, at home or on the street, going to bed or rising. Tell them to your children, or may your house fall down, may illness make you helpless, and your children turn their eyes from you. So he says, tell the truth. But here's the beauty of it. People have been doing that forever.
True.
And despite all the oppression, all the murder, all the genocide throughout history, Francesca still exists.
Thank God for that.
With her pure heart and her truth-telling and her calm but confident defense of reality. And millions like her. That's where the hope is. It's not in the systems.
I'm so grateful you shared that poem, and I'm happy to hear you frame hope in a way that gives me hope, selfishly. I've followed your work, and you've spoken about addiction, something I've struggled with, quite frankly, as someone with ADHD, but also I love how you talk about it more broadly and sort of dispel some preconceived notions we might have around it. You talk about it as a spiritual crisis, which resonates for me. So I wonder, if you'll allow me, could we say the West is addicted to domination, to supremacy, to being right at all costs, even when the facts prove they're not? Is there
And even when it causes harm to themselves.
Exactly. And that's what I'm getting at. Moral injury, if you will. I
Yeah.
know many people. I was born in the States. I didn't grow up there. I grew up all over the world, but I went to school there. I went to Columbia. I briefly taught at Columbia. So to watch what happened with Columbia, to watch these institutions that when I was more naive and young and I believed in sort of these ideals, right? I know there are many friends of mine in the US, in Europe, around the world who are devastated on an emotional level
I
by
know.
what their governments are doing in their name, perhaps with their tax
And,
dollars.
and what their media is doing.
Exactly. And I wonder, what's the path to healing when complicity becomes so unbearable? Today, if you show empathy for Palestinians alone, you can be fired, you can be silenced, you can be banned, and worse. I wonder what happens to a society that treats empathy like a threat, like a weakness, as Elon Musk famously said recently, right? What role do we, people who are ordinary, for lack of a better word, or just your day-to-day people play in shifting this structure of dehumanization? Is it possible to take on the multinational corporations that are not just enabling this genocide, but so much pain and suffering, putting profits over people as a policy, refining the tools? You said that the Dutch East India Company and Palantir, this isn't new. You're right. But if I may, I do believe the consolidation of power, the amount of power with the technological advancements that these companies, and how much we're reliant on them, all of us, and how much access they have to our privacy. Do you think this system, call it capitalism, call it whatever it is, unfettered capitalism, is it compatible with empathy and justice? What are the psychological impacts of for all of us living in a system where value is strictly measured in profit, and people, whether Palestinian now or in the future enter another ethnic identity, are just obstacles to that profit?
That's always been the case. So that throughout capitalist history, you see massacres of workers, the suppression of movements of liberation, either internally or externally. You've seen this all along.
Mm.
Noam Chomsky was asked once if he was an optimist or a pessimist. And he said, technically, he says, strategically, I'm an optimist, and tactically, I'm a pessimist.
Tactically.
Yeah, which means that, look, in the short term, we're going to lose. That's just how it is. Because they have the power and we don't. And their power is not quite, but almost infinite. At this point in Canada where I live, if you're a medical person and you express some words of criticism about the assault, the deliberate murder, torture of medical workers in Palestine, you lose your job. And the Israel lobby and its various institutions are infinitely resourced, relentless, and remorseless in coming after you. That's what's going to happen. But in the long term, the very rabidity of their assault on truth tellers tells their desperation.
Fair enough.
Why are they desperate? Let me find you another quote, if I may.
Please.
There's a wonderful writer called Omar El Akkad.
I love his new book. What a brilliant writer.
Yeah.
He
So
makes it accessible.
I'm looking for that book. Let me just quote you a few.
Please. One day everyone will have always been against this, right?
Yeah, it's one of the best books I've read for a long time.
I
He
agree.
says, rules, conventions, morals, reality itself all exist so long as their existence is convenient to the preservation of power. Otherwise, they, like all else, are expendable. And then he says, this is an account of a fracture, a breaking away from the notion that the polite Western liberal ever stood for anything at all. And then finally he says, this is to your point now, what has happened, for all the future bloodshed it will prompt, will be remembered as the moment millions of people looked at the West, the rules-based order, the shell of modern liberalism, and the capitalist thing it serves, and said, I want nothing to do with this. So that's happening. And it's happening amongst a lot of Jews, a lot of young Jews.
When I was in my darkest moments, I was living in Tunisia when October 7th happened. And in the weeks after that, I thought, if I just make 20 videos a day and post them on Instagram, I'll somehow manage to pierce through the propaganda of the West and mainstream media, if you will. And I guess why I share this with you is it was young Jewish people I knew, but also many more who I didn't, who I came to know through the internet, for better or worse, even beyond the siloed, walled off identities. And I just have to say, and I say this because it's the truth, the film Israelism, your son Aaron and I have a lot of friends who are Jewish in New York that we know in common, and especially the younger Jewish people who have chosen to, at quite a high cost. And oftentimes Palestinians got upset when I would amplify the videos and the testimonies and the posts that young Jewish people were posting. And the reason they said this to me was, we don't need white Jewish people to speak
Yeah,
for us. And I said, I understand why you feel that way,
yeah.
but unfortunately, strategically, we do. I think change comes best from within, and that's where I get hope. And I know that I was the one asking you the question, but and I hope I'm not interrupting you, because Omar El Akkad, I think, is an example of, okay, not a Jewish person, but someone who can speak in such a way, much like Francesca, even if in a different modality, that it's so accessible and it's so hard to unfeel and unsee the truths that he writes. And
Well, look, so there's another writer who you probably know, Mohammed El Kurd,
yes, he's a good friend.
who wrote, well, wonderful writer. His book, Perfect Victims,
Yeah,
I think it's an even greater book than Omar's book. And I think Mohammed would say, why is Gabor given such prominence? Because he happens to be Jewish and a survivor.
sure.
So when I speak of, yeah, why am I giving such relative prominence? But when I speak of these young Jews, I only mean that if
Yeah.
these people who grew up propagandized all their lives,
Mm-hmm.
then after the shock of October the 7th,
Mm-hmm.
they're able to look at Palestinian suffering, that gives me hope in humanity.
I hear you. And
Yes, and so when you ask me where's the hope, I'm saying the hope is in humanity itself. It's in Palestinian humanity, it's in Jewish humanity, it's in universal humanity. And I think anybody who wants to speak the truth, and this is historically a fact, better be faced with
yeah.
accepting that you're going to be defeated over and over and over and over again. And I can joke that it's kind of my misfortune to always identify with the losers.
I can totally relate. What is that
Yeah.
about?
So when I read the Roman history, who do I identify with? Spartacus
Exactly.
and the slave rebellion.
Mm.
And look at Hungarian history. Who do I identify with? All the revolutions and fights for liberation that were defeated, and so on. But there's something in me, and not just in me, but in you and a lot of people who just thirst for justice and truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that has never been extirpated. So when you ask, where's the hope? That's where the hope is.
I'm gonna condense my last few questions, if you will, just into an honest share from my side to you, and I'll be very respectful of your time. Thank you for being generous. One of the things, when I was depressed in the past 5-10 years, for many reasons, when I was in my darkest times, it was oftentimes I would listen to your voice, your theories, your humanity, and it would somehow, especially the way you talk about healing, the way you made healing accessible and how I could synthesize it. So with that in mind, how do we speak about healing when it seems to me, and it feels more palpable than ever, that the very structures of our societies are built to dominate, to dehumanize? What would, in your mind, collective healing even require? I mean, if we can't rely on governments or the courts or the media even, I know you say we place our hope in humanity and in these connections, much like the one we're having right now. What would you say, succinctly, if you can, to a young person who feels for Palestinians, feels for others, who has empathy in their heart and in their body, in their soul, but feels helpless, disillusioned, enraged, numb? I told you a little bit about addiction earlier. Do I escape to something constructive? Do I escape to a marijuana joint, to alcoholism, to whatever it might be? How can young people living through this moment begin not just to resist all these systems that oppress us, but to remain human? In this moment of collective grief, what role does imagination play? How do we survive this moment, and not just survive it, but hopefully create a different world?
Who in you is asking all these questions?
The child who's sad and scared.
No.
Should I try again?
Who in you is asking all these questions?
Who in me?
Yeah,
I don't know. There's so many people in me.
I know. That's what I'm saying. Okay, well, it's a rhetorical question.
Okay,
I could do an exercise with you here, but I won't.
please do.
No, no. Okay, now look. When you think of freedom or justice
Mm-hmm.
and your hunger for them, just feel into your body. Think of truth, or think of Francesca, who's an avatar of truth. Or if my work means anything to you, which it does, think of me.
Mm-hmm.
But think of all that, and what do you experience?
So it's where you put your focus.
It's where you put your focus. And the person that's asking the question is somebody precisely who believes in all that.
Yeah.
So you say, where do you find it? You find it right here.
Well, on that note, before I get too emotional, thank you for being so candid and compassionate and so honest with me. And I really do want to tell you that just I hope one thing, which is that more and more people, like you just described to me, can find it in themselves to really dig deep or look inside themselves, because I have escaped from many things in my life. And one of the things, if I'm truly honest, that I've escaped from most often and most fervently is myself, and the parts of myself that either scare me because they're true and real. Hopefully, this conversation can inspire other people to stop running from themselves and to look into themselves for hopes, not always to others. So thank you for being a conduit for me for so many.
Thank you. I just want to say one final thing.
Please.
Is that what people should realize is I struggle with the same stuff like everybody else. I know I'm articulate and I can touch upon verities. I know that. I got that gift. But you know what? In terms of anxiety or depression or despair or hopelessness, I can go through all those states. So I don't want to pretend that I'm this representative of something
Enlightenment.
So we're just all human beings going through the same stuff. I just want people to be aware of that.
No, and I appreciate you sharing that, because it's really human connection, whether planned or not planned, that keeps me going in my darkest times. And even connecting with you really is a privilege, and really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.